The sun hung low over the dusty town of Red Hollow, bleeding gold across the wooden storefronts and hitching posts. When Caleb Thornridge rode in like a man who owned not just the land, but fate itself. Folks stepped aside when they heard the steady rhythm of his stallion's hooves. He was the most powerful landowner in 3 counties, master of sprawling ranches, cattle by the thousands, and rail contracts that stitched the territory to the rest of the world. His black coat was tailored back east, his boots polished, his jaw carved from pride and iron. Caleb Thornridge was not a man who looked down at the ground. He expected the world to look up at him. Near the general store, sitting in the shadow of a cracked wooden porch, was a woman most folks pretended not to see. Her dress was worn thin by years of sun and hardship. Dust clung to her sleeves. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out a tin cup that carried more silence than coins. Her hair, once golden like prairie wheat, was now dull beneath a faded shawl. She did not beg loudly. She did not plead. She simply existed in a place that had long ago forgotten her name. Caleb's son, Samuel, rode just behind him on a smaller bay horse. The boy was no older than 9, sharp-eyed, thoughtful, and quieter than most children raised in privilege. Unlike his father, Samuel noticed things. He noticed how the town blacksmith limped from an old war wound. He noticed how the widow Carter counted every penny twice before buying flour. And that afternoon, he noticed the beggar woman. Caleb guided his horse forward without breaking stride. He had no time for misery. Misfortune, in his mind, was a result of weakness. He had clawed his empire from dust and drought. He owed nothing to those who had failed to do the same. The woman's tin cup rattled softly as the breeze brushed past her. Then Samuel's breath caught. He leaned forward in his saddle, eyes fixed on the woman's face. Something in her features, something buried beneath the lines of hardship, struck him like lightning. "Up, up," the boy whispered. Caleb did not slow his horse. "Pub," Samuel's voice trembled. "That's Ma!" The reins jerked hard in Caleb's hands. His stallion snorted as it came to a sudden halt. The word echoed louder than a gunshot in his mind. Ma? Impossible. His wife, Eleanor Thornridge, had been declared dead 8 years ago after a wagon accident during a violent river crossing. The wreckage had been found. The current had been merciless. No body recovered. Caleb had mourned briefly, buried his grief beneath work, and hardened himself for the sake of ambition and survival. He had convinced himself that love was a distraction and pain was a luxury. Slowly, Caleb turned in the saddle. The woman had lifted her head at the sound of the boy's voice. Their eyes met. Time did not merely slow, it fractured. Though age and suffering had altered her face, there was no mistaking those eyes. The same storm-gray eyes that once challenged him. The same eyes that had softened when she held their newborn son. The same eyes that had begged him years ago not to choose land deals over family dinners. Eleanor. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The town seemed to fade away. Caleb dismounted without realizing he had done so. His boots hit the dust with a heaviness he had never known. He walked toward her, each step stripping him of certainty. "You're dead," he said, though it sounded more like a question. A faint, broken smile touched her lips. "I tried not to be. The river accident had not taken her. It had thrown her miles downstream. Injured, unconscious, strangers had found her, poor farmers, barely surviving themselves. She had suffered memory loss for months. By the time her mind cleared, Caleb had already left the area, expanding westward, unreachable. She had tried to find him, but without money, without connections, without even proper identification, she had become another forgotten soul drifting between towns. And as the years passed, pride kept her silent. She had heard of Caleb Thornridge, the ruthless land baron, the man who no longer resembled the husband she once knew. "I didn't want to stand in the way of what you were building," she said quietly. "So I stayed gone." Samuel slid off his horse and ran to her without hesitation. He threw his arms around her as though no time had passed. Eleanor trembled as she held him, tears cutting clean paths through dust on her cheeks. Caleb stood frozen. He had conquered land. He had bent markets. He had crushed rivals. But he had failed the one person who had once begged him to simply come home before sunset. Around them, townsfolk whispered. The mighty Thornridge Empire suddenly felt small, fragile, as the tin cup resting beside Eleanor's knee. For the first time in years, Caleb Thornridge did not know what to do, and that frightened him more than losing everything ever could. That night, the Thornridge mansion on the hill did not feel like a fortress. Its high ceilings echoed with memory instead of authority. Eleanor sat by the fireplace wrapped in a clean blanket, her frail figure swallowed by a leather chair far too grand for her current state. Servants moved cautiously, unsure whether to treat her as a beggar or their mistress reborn. Caleb stood near the window overlooking miles of land that carried his name. Usually the sight filled him with triumph. Tonight it accused him. "You built all this," Eleanor said softly behind him. "Yes, and yet you rode past me." Her words were not bitter. That made them worse. Caleb turned slowly. "I thought you were gone. I buried you in my mind." "You buried more than that." Silence stretched between them, thick and honest. Samuel sat on the rug, watching both of them with wide eyes. Children understood truth better than adults. He could feel the weight of unspoken years pressing against the walls. "I was angry," Caleb admitted finally. "After the accident, at the river, at God, at weakness. I decided if I hardened myself enough, nothing could hurt me again." Eleanor nodded faintly. "And did it work?" He looked at her hands, thin, scarred, trembling. "No." The next morning, Caleb did something that shocked the entire territory. He rode into town without his tailored coat, without his silver watch, without the armor of superiority. He walked into the bank he controlled and withdrew, a sum large enough to rebuild half of Red Hollow. Then he visited every struggling family he knew by name but had never acknowledged. Debts were forgiven, mortgages were reduced. The widow Carter's home was repaired. The blacksmith's son was offered work at fair wages. Whispers turned to disbelief. Disbelief turned to respect, not the fearful kind Caleb once commanded, but the kind earned through humility. But the true change did not happen in town. It happened at home. Caleb began coming in before sunset. He ate at the same table as his family instead of in his office. He listened. He learned that Eleanor had survived winters sleeping in barns, that she had traded her wedding ring for medicine once. That pride had kept her from revealing herself when she finally recognized his name in a newspaper. She had wanted him to become a better man on his own, not because she returned to remind him. "I never stopped loving you," she told him one evening on the porch as the prairie wind moved gently through tall grass. "I stopped knowing how to love," he replied. Healing was not instant. Years of absence cannot be erased by a single apology. But day by day, something stronger than pride took root in Caleb Thornridge's heart. Gratitude. One afternoon, months later, Caleb rode again through Red Hollow. This time Eleanor rode beside him. Samuel laughed between them, the sound carrying freely across open land. They passed the same spot near the general store where she had once sat, with a tin cup. Caleb slowed his horse. He looked at the empty patch of dirt and felt a chill, not of regret, but of remembrance. He had almost lost the greatest treasure he ever possessed, because he was too busy proving he possessed everything else. He reached for Eleanor's hand. The town no longer stepped aside in fear when he rode through. They nodded in respect, and Caleb Thornridge, once the hardest man in the territory, finally understood something no amount of land or gold could teach. Power without compassion is poverty. Years later, when Samuel grew into a man and took over the ranch, he would tell his own children the story, not of wealth, not of empire, but of the day a whisper stopped the strongest man in the West. "Pa," he would say, smiling at the memory, "that's Ma." And that was the moment the Thornridge legacy truly began, not in land, deeds, or cattle brands, but in humility, forgiveness, and love reclaimed from the dust. The end.